Welcome to the Outskirts Film Podcast. I'm Christopher Small, and today I'm joined, as usual, by my co-hosts.
Hello, I'm Uku. Konbanwa.
Hi, I'm Alonso Aguilar.
You're not going to try that, Alonso?
No, not this time. I already did my bit with the fake Brazilian in the Sudoku Show episode, so yeah, I'm good for a while.
Today we're going to talk about the ex-husband of one of our favorite filmmakers, Kinyo Tanaka. That is, we're going to talk about the films of Hiroshi Shimizu, the great filmmaker of spas, schools, and children. We also have two special guests today. Direct from the Outskirts editorial team, we're joined by Nathan Letoré.
Hi, everyone.
And David Phelps.
Hi.
David is the author of the mammoth 8,000-word exegesis of Shimizu's films that we published in our third issue. Now that article is available on Outskirts Online and on our Letterboxd, we thought it was the perfect time to bring David on the podcast and revisit the films of this most perennially underrated of Japanese classical masters, to try to appraise the various masks Shimizu would adopt throughout his career, to discuss some of the conceptual frameworks that David uses throughout his article to make sense of this man's body of work, and of course to chat about the movies themselves. So welcome everybody. Thinking about this idea of Shimizu being underrated on some level, when I was in Japan in 2024, I was on my way to Tokyo and I wanted to make a stop in Hamamatsu, which is the prefecture of Shimizu's birth. And when I randomly mentioned this to a friend, she told me that there's really no sign in Hamamatsu that Shimizu was born there, but there is a museum dedicated to Keisuke Kinoshita, who was born there and who's apparently more of a significant filmmaker. I think that says a lot of how Shimizu, even now after a few cycles of canonization and extra interest, still remains quite a marginal figure. And it's why, David, I think you were really lucky to have seen so many Shimizus all at once in a cinema at the MoMI in this extraordinary retrospective. So maybe we can just start there also with a kind of material history of how we discovered Shimizu and his films. Did you have a history with his films before that program?
No, and I do just want to also give a huge shout out to Japan Society and MoMI and the programmers there, because it was heroic work. I mean, it was something like 25 films ish, something like that, and it was all on 35 millimeter. I think. I don't think there was a single DCP. So to be able to do that is just it's quite incredible. And there were still, of course, I mean, one of the wonders of Shimizu is that after that was done, I watched another equal amount of films at home, and they're all probably almost all just as incredible. So it's really. And even within that context, right, there's like 160 films or something, I think, that he made, and about a quarter of those are surviving. So there's just still so much we'll never even know about this career and what it entailed.
Also, we wanted to bring Nathan into the conversation because I know from the start Nathan has been a big Shimizuian. Oh, I don't know what an acolyte of Shimizu is, but I know you've been a long-time Shimizu guy.
So first I'd like to start by, thanking David for his article, which I think is a very, very good and very important one. I first discovered Shimizu way back in 2008 because I was studying Japanese back then, and I was on a term abroad in Japan, and Shochiku put out their first 4-film DVD box set, which then became the Eclipse DVD box set in the US. And then a bit later they put out a second one with four of the children's films. And I was a young cinephile in Japan, and I'd read somewhere, I think maybe from Olaf Möller, that Shimizu was a great director and he was overlooked. And so I thought, I might as well give this guy a try. And the first film I watched was Mr. Thank You, which still today is one of my absolute favorite films. And so it was a huge, huge rediscovery for me. It was like discovering, Jean Vigo or Jean Renoir Arabesque Kiarostami or something like that. And so I wrote my dissertation about Shimizu. I've been struggling with that ever since, which is that I love Shimizu, but I have trouble writing about him, and maybe it's because I love him too much. And then the second period of that rediscovery for me was 2022, and I was living in Paris, and it was the Cinémathèque Française retrospective. And now I think, I'm very happy there's a lot of stuff going on with Shimizu, and people are slowly beginning to know him, but I'd still say we're far from, he's not quite yet a household name in the way that, Ozu or Renoir or whoever could be. And which is why I'm very happy that we published David's piece, which is a very good one and a very important one.
I feel like these canonical discussions about filmmakers is inevitable, especially from programming perspectives, because that's what is appealing to public, like discovering a figure in the history of cinema. But I always feel like when we discuss these underrated quote unquote figures, we always kind of create this paradoxical turn because we end up comparing them to canonical ones like Ozu or Mizoguchi. I think it's really inevitable not to mention them. But even while trying to value a person's work, comparing to the other that people can maybe qualify as overrated. So it kind of creates this paradoxical dilemma that I found interesting. I just wanted to mention that.
I think it actually is a really kind of good place maybe to start, which is to ask, like, why isn't Shimizu better known? What is the reason for that? And I have some theories, but I do think it is a reflection of the history of film criticism itself to ask, like, why is Mizoguchi so important and Ozu so important and Shimizu wasn't? And then also, conversely, why is Shimizu so important today? Like, why are we all responding to Shimizu when perhaps previous generations did not? And like, what has changed, right? That has made him seem so contemporary in a way that in the maybe 70s or 80s he seemed completely passé. And I think like one theory I have about this is that he is really hard to write about. Like, it is really difficult. It is really difficult to write about filmmakers who are obsessed with presence, right? Filmmakers who are obsessed with representation are very easy to write about. You can start to decode the allegories and the mythologies and the themes, and you get these thematic directors where it's like, if you want to talk about Ozu or Mizoguchi, there's always a big theme that you can cover, right? And you can talk about the plight of women in Mizoguchi. You can talk about, the horrors of marriage or in Ozu. But there's this very clear thematic line that lets us do literary analysis, I think. And literary analysis is something I'm trained in and like I gravitate to, and it's a lot easier than saying, oh, the way the sun shines through the trees in this particular shot in, the mountains just is so beautiful on the landscape. And I think like that's definitely a piece of it. It is a lot harder to write about Shimizu, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do it. And I think, even if you read my piece, like I fall back on a lot of kind of literary analysis in doing it, because it's like that's how I know how to make sense of things in words. But it doesn't really do justice to the films themselves and the actual experience and the presence of watching them. We are maybe now in an era after years of docufiction where we now have a kind of vernacular to appreciate films of presence and films of, people hanging out and films of people chilling and being. I think that's a piece of it. The other kind of theory that I have is that a lot of contemporary film criticism was really founded in the 50s. And so in the 1950s is really kind of the key era for what we conceive of as contemporary film criticism. Obviously, we can go back and read John Epstein or something from the 20s, but like for the most part, it's cahiers de cinema, right? It's like that era. And I do think, the filmmakers who were great in the 50s tended to get a lot of, accolades throughout time. And frankly, the 50s were not really Shimizu's strongest era, I think, in some ways. Like, he really is a filmmaker of the 30s and 40s. He's really a pre-war filmmaker in a lot of ways. And there's a lot going on in the 50s films that's very beautiful and I really love. But I think about it almost like Fritz Lang or something, where it's like the really visionary stuff comes early, and then in the later stuff, you're really, trying to read these films through the ways that they're operating within a very almost like televisual kind of vernacular that can feel sad at first, that it's a loss from what was there before. So these are my own kind of pet theories for why Shimizu has been underlooked, underrated, but I'm sure there's many other reasons too.
Something quite specific about the memory hole in which Shimizu fell, which is that he wasn't actually ignored. Like if you look at the 1936 Kinema Junpo, which is the great very famous Japanese film magazine, their 1936 film of the year was Mr. Thank You. So it's not like he was never known. It's not like he was ignored. It's more like he was recognized and then somehow he wasn't remembered. And your point about the 50s and what we think of as film culture having derived from film critics in the 50s, I think is a very good point. Beyond that, I don't really have much of an explanation for why he then was forgotten in that way.
My experience, I guess, is a little bit different because, like in Latin America, Shimizu there hasn't been like any retrospective about like his work or anything. Kind of historically struggled with Mizoguchi, like that level of like severity and like the rigor in his filmmaking is something I kind of bounce off of in general in filmmakers. So actually, I think it was someone that told me like, oh, you should try Shimizu. He's like the antithesis of Mizoguchi.
It's the light Mizoguchi.
not like Mizoguchi. He was like explaining to me as like he's the antithesis spiritually of this filmmaker, which to me was not necessarily the case. Actually, that helped me also understand while watching the Shimizu films, because I had only watched like Mr. Denki before, and the next film I watched was Sayon's Bell, which was kind of like a weird transition, like very jarring transition. And I think I also told Chris and Oiku afterwards. After watching Sayon's Bell, I read your piece, and the open and close dichotomy kind of will help understand my own taste around not only Shimizu, but like this kind of like gestures and this period of like studio filmmaking in Japan in a way. Yeah, the openness of Shimizu, I think, also kind of like contrasts with the, as you were saying, alluding to like what criticism, like the auteur theory in the 1950s kind of like favored. This more like informally, at least, like the rigor of like the composition and these more like aestheticized elements, which I think in Shimizu they are there, but it's more like freewheeling and like almost like contingent in some way.
But something I felt while watching these films, quite a few of them in quick succession, is really just how much of a kind of heterogeneous filmmaker he is in a really big way. I mean, because if you're only looking at a film like The Masseuse and a Woman, I think it's really possible to extrapolate from that immediately that you're experiencing a sensibility that is, as distinctive as Renoir, as Nathan said. I also had that exact same feeling, I think, when I first saw that film. But then also, digging into the films that are on the kind of outer reaches, or the films that have been rediscovered from different periods, from the late 50s, from the silent era, whatever. I just really get this sense of someone who is extremely varied and who had these different periods of kind of different kinds of inspiration, drawn to different subjects. But at some point, some point his style looked like this, some point his style looked like that, some point his style looked like that. I was thinking about Japanese Girls at the Harbor versus Notes on an Itinerant Performer versus Girls Reform School. Those are like three films really not made by the same person if you just put them side by side. But it's that like heterogeneity that I'm drawn to big time in Shimizu, that I don't necessarily attach a qualitative marker on that. It's just like he's a fascinating figure to contemplate for that, in that sense. And also when you compare him to these Japanese filmmakers, as everybody else does, those guys are much more consistent. Even someone like Naruse, I think, who's sort of jumping all over the place in a similar way, I see much more of a through line there, whereas Shimizu, to me at least, is much more of a kind of enigmatic figure, and the more I watch, the less I kind of understand about him.
I actually don't know that I agree with that. I think, once you get really deep into like Naruse, for example, and you're watching White Beast or like Spring Awakens, like this whole other kind of filmmaker emerges. And I think it's just important, right, for a lot of us to remember the classical era was full of filmmakers who would often take on genre exercises, things they didn't write, do it by assignment, because it was a way for them to get paid and try something that was formally interesting and ensure that they then had the resources to make the stuff they really cared about and that they could go back to. So, like, you know, when we approached John Ford because we all watched the first same 10 movies, and that establishes for us what John Ford is. And only later do we start looking at, you know, weird, you know, Eddie G. Robinson gangster films or musicals that he made, right? Which he did. Like, John Ford made musicals, right? But we look at that later and we see that as the exception to the rule because we've been trained in how to see John Ford. Buñuel, I think, similarly, right? It's like you don't start by watching all the 1950s melodramas. You know that you come to those later and then you read them through what you understand to be, you know, the archetypical lens of a Buñuel film. And I think with Shimizu, because none of us have a canon for Shimizu, we're all just kind of, you know, wandering into the equivalent of like these B films by Buñuel or a Ford sometimes, and then trying to make sense of it because the canon has not been established. But actually, I think Shimizu is extremely consistent across his career. Like, there are just pet themes he will just come back to over and over again. And especially if you look at the scripts he writes, he's going to find a way to put them in, right? There will be something about people who are injured, always, right? There's going to be something about it, like a public transient space that's like a bus or a spa, like somewhere where people are passing through, right? And a bunch of different people from different walks of life are all going to interact with each other, like in that kind of environment. There's going to be something about, there's going to be deep space, there's going to be a lateral tracking shot. like these things are just like almost a given, even if you go to like what I would consider his, like, you know, least spirited 1950s films, you'll still find these elements just like strewn in there in a way that is like really a distinctive kind of auteurist marker of someone who's just very clearly obsessed with the same situations and themes and keeps coming back to them over and over again. So yeah, there are lots of Shimizu films that like don't, you know, fit the mold because he did them on assignment, or there were chances for him to experiment or try something out. But I don't think that's that unusual in the classical era. And I think there's almost a fear of modern contemporary filmmakers to do that because they feel so wedded to auteurism, right? That they have to maintain their brand and their status, and that they have to be known as this set figure. And there's something really nice about classical filmmakers that they were freed from that, I think, as well.
Yeah, maybe the difference is that the heterogeneity comes from the same, like in the same time period, especially in the 40s. We have this because we tend to build these biographical aesthetic narratives through a filmmaker's life when they're auteurs. So he turned from this type of filmmaking to that one, whereas I think in Shimizu's case he was making them simultaneously in the same year. So maybe that's a bit different, but I agree with you in that sense that the themes that keep coming back throughout his career, but I think the diversity is that they happen in the same time period, because our brains, our auteurist brain tends to create maybe a chronological approach to these movements within a filmmaker's career.
You think about, like, you know, Children of Four Seasons, right? Like, that's clearly a film that was shot over 4 seasons. And I don't know the history of this production, but it's clearly something that in like 1938, when he has like 3 other films that he's making, he clearly keeps coming back to it. I think the way that like Johnny To keeps coming back to Sparrow, or like, you know, Linklater came back to Boy, you know, and there is this way that these kind of filmmakers who often will try lots of things out clearly are also establishing what for them is a really personal film that they're going to come back to and make over a much longer period of time. And those are really special. Like, there's very few cases of that in the history of cinema, and they're quite meaningful.
There's that ability in the to and fro between the personal films and we can call them the assignment films. With the great directors, there's that ability to have those two aspects of their work feed into each other. And this is maybe the moment where we can discuss what you call the closed films and the open films as categories. And I think it's a very good and very useful categorization, but it becomes very interesting when, in addition, we can start seeing what is closed in the open films and what is open in the closed films. One of the archetypal films of what you call the closed films for you was Forget Love for Now. And that was a very important film for me because it let me understand something that's essential to the way Shimizu operates in terms of his patterns and his, let's call it his narrative constructions, which is the game of repetition and variation, So he films a certain event in a certain way with a certain camera setup. And then if, 10 minutes later, he comes back to it and the same thing happens and he films it the same way. And so a pattern is set. And then, a bit further on in the film, it happens for a third time, but with a variation. So a character is absent or another one has come in and it's filmed in the same way again. And so that's how the narrative progresses in a lot of Shimizu films, is through that attention paid to what remains the same and what changes. And so it's very obvious in Forget Love for Now, which is it's a closed film, like you say. So it's a very formally controlled film. But in a way, that's exactly what happens with Children in the Wind or 4 Seasons of Children. They're constantly doing the same things over and over again, and then you see the evolution of the family and of their situation through what isn't the same from one repetition to the next.
Still just kind of incredible that Shimizu was doing this in the 1930s. This is something that Hu Shaoshan has gotten so much acclaim for, justifiably, for almost like reinventing cinema in the 80s. But Shimizu was doing it 50 years before. It's really it's just extraordinary, I think. And another reason I think why he was maybe not appreciated in his time is these are a lot of what is really impressive about his filmography is very, very much from 80s onward kind of idea of cinema of presence, a cinema of temporality, of duration. All of these things are things that we now venerate in the slow cinema era, but definitely did not at the time.
If you think in relation to Children of the Beehive and this, I forget the English name of the second one.
It's Children of the Beehive 2, What Happened Next? It should be the name of every sequel. Every sequel should just have a colon and then say what happened next. Yeah.
Shimizu is doing exactly the same gesture as what Kiarostami did in the first 2 films of his Coco trilogy, right? He's got a film about children that's moderately successful, quite successful, maybe not as much as Where's the Friend's House was in Iran. And then he goes back and he makes a film that is not a sequel, but that happens within the world in which the film was filmed. And if you think about it, it's a crazily radical gesture, and it's not a contest. No one needs to brag about doing anything first, but he was doing it 40 years before Kiarostami.
That's something that I go through a lot in the piece, is trying to ask what does it mean that children are in some ways kind of the heart of neo-realism, right? We think about Anika Bobo, the Oliveira film. We think about, Germany Year Zero. These films are all dealing with children processing grief. And then I think, Children of Beehive is kind of an obvious example of that in 48. But if you go back earlier, what Shimizu is doing with kids, the kind of theory I have for this is that I think a lot of times we think that kids can't act, and so that makes them more real. And so there's this idea of you want to look at what is real and precious and innocent and sweet in the world, and judge that against the fallen apocalypse of the post-war world. You take the innocence of children against the grief and horrors of mankind in the adult world, right? And you put those together, you get neo-realism. And there's definitely something to that for the late 40s. But I think actually what's really interesting that Shimizu really gets, and I think Renoir kind of gets this a little bit too sometimes, right, is that children actually are always acting. Children are never real. Children are always performing. They're always creating games. They're always in this world of their own imagination. And, part of what I find really beautiful in a Shimizu film is often how it's contemplating the roles that people have to play in society and the roles that they're being told to play. So, for example, I watched Dawn Chorus last night, which is about a woman learning how to be a bus driver, and just all the intricacies of what the right thing is to say to the right person at the right time. It goes on for 30 minutes, right? In documentary detail about about like what you're allowed to say to who. And there's that element, right? I think like Notes of an Itinerant Performer, the closed films, right, are really obsessed with like what is the role playing for adults, that they have to fulfill this role and this function in, indoctrinated into this, broader society. But then on the other hand, the role playing can be really, liberating. Like the role playing is a way to break out of their poverty and to imagine themselves in other worlds and to, recreate the world around them in a way that they can actually control as well. I try to say that a little bit in the piece, but in some ways, like the kids are filmmakers. Like the kids are going and they're producing these little scenes for themselves, right? That they can act in and they can direct and that they can perform. And that's their way of exerting agency over life that the adults don't necessarily have in these movies.
Do you want to talk a bit about the Wiseman connection, especially since Wiseman has just left us?
The reason I keep coming back to like thinking about Shimizu and Wiseman as kind of two sides of the same coin, I guess, in some ways, is they're opposite in some ways, right? Like Shimizu in some ways for me is like the great filmmaker who manages to take fiction and turn it into documentary. And I think Wiseman in some ways is like the great filmmaker for me who takes documentary and turns it into fiction. But there's a kind of meeting point, I think, between those two places. What they really have in common, I think, most is like this obsession with the institution and like, in a fully public space, how is everyone always playing a role when they are in a fully public space where they have to interact with other people in particularly a professional setting? And like, what does that do to almost erase the individual, but also or to turn the individual into this almost like, mysterious apparition, right? That you can sense, but you can't quite see. And so there is almost this, I don't want to say religious element, but there's this element of like mystery to these films that you want to know who these people are, and you don't necessarily know because you're only seeing them in the context of the public role that they're playing. I think, the obsession with schools runs deep for both of them. Shimizu made at least half a dozen films about schools, probably more. Wiseman kept coming back to schools in various settings. So, of course, high school and high school too, but then also these 4 films in the mid-'80s. And then I think there's also, really this obsession with marginalization and like what does it mean for people who live on the margins to have to face off against the kind of institutional authority at the center, and what does that conflict look like, right? To have the people who are injured and hurt by society then have to like re-enter into it. And I would say finally, like there's an element where I think they both start very radical, almost like politically radical, like the earlier Shimizu films from the early 30s, like the mid 60s kinds of films. These are obviously radical eras politically, and I think you see that very much reflected through both these filmmakers, where they're almost very anti-institutional, right? The adult world is this horrible place of transactions and capitalism, and the children are this, free from that and are being, tormented by it in some ways. And then they start to change, right? Like as their careers go on, you start to see them taking almost this more humanist view of the institution as a place that can actually rehabilitate people or support them or, let them attain some sort of, self-fulfillment, self-enactment, and self-agency that they haven't had before. And so it becomes a lot more confusing what their actual view is on the institution. What those have in common is both the institution, but I think also this idea of play and acting and play acting that kind of runs through them all, where, with performance. And then finally, there's this kind of just beautiful almost rhyme between Mr. and a Woman and then Wiseman's Blind, where they're both making films about characters who are blind. And the way that they film them is by filming directly in front of them and then tracking back. So as the characters walk or move, they walk towards the camera, and you as a viewer cannot see what's in front of them. So you're watching them, but you are also in the same space as them, that you are not aware of what's in front of them either. You're also blind. And it's, I don't know, I'm very moved by that gesture. I think it's really empathetic, and I think it's really beautiful.
I think these characters often resist the interiority, the intimate spaces, and their connections are often built through gestures, material gestures, or the expressions of these performances as roles in given spaces. Like when you think of the bus driver in Mr. Thank You, he's a bus driver that everyone like projects this identity or this role to him. So everyone projects this role, and he's unable to go outside this territory, what's attributed to him. So he has to be Mr. Thank You. In that film, maybe this doesn't create a certain conflict, but when you think of the female characters in the film, that roles, that attributes always creates a conflict. So there's, I think, a gender divide between those, but maybe that can also be interpreted in different films through the stigma of being blind. So being blind means something, and these characters are often try to tread their way to this particular role, and how they either go beyond that role or conform to that identity. So I think we can take any film of Shimizu and use this formula to analyze how characters either defy or end up being conformed to these roles that are projected on themselves, and they end up being interiorizing them.
Yeah, I thought about that actually in Children in the Wind. If you think of the plot itself, might have this thing, another filmmaker, this single mother arc of when the father is going away and she has to take care of the kids. But since the film is focused on the kids, shenanigans and what they're creating, it's kind of this tension in a way I was thinking about. Going back to the idea of this social role, that the gender social role that of the single mother that is in constant tension with the kids, creating their own kind of narratives throughout the film. So as David was saying, with the filmmakers, they kind of always finding new ways of entering roles and going out of them, the seeking for monsters on the lake, and then the famous makeshift swimming competition they have. And this tension between the possibilities of always creating your own roles as a kid, in this constant foray of looking for moments of meaning, and this more assumed tension of being the adult in the room. And that also comes in that film when this female figure has to confront literally the kid in the film of you actually have to behave. You can't go on this adventures all the time, now that he's supposed to take this more adult role since the father figure is missing. So to me it's always interesting also. I tend to love those more freewheeling, as I was mentioning, almost erratic kids experiences in the films, but when they confront with these moments of tension with the more adult roles that are supposed to be in the film as well. To me, those are perhaps the more effective dramatic moments.
Yeah, I think this is probably also a good chance to maybe say something about style. We're used to thinking about deep space, I think, in very Gothic contexts, right? Of these, large arched, almost artificial passageways. And instead what Shimizu is doing is he's using deep space to really open up space beyond the camera. There's times in his films where you get a sense there's people running behind the camera. It's planted in the middle of the room, and there's people coming from all different doorways. And I think the lateral tracking shots are like that too, that he's moving the shot across because he can't capture all of the space. It literally overwhelms the screen beyond what he's able to show. And so you always have the sense, right, that you're just getting this small window into this much bigger world, which connects it to documentary. And I think to go back to the question of why isn't Shimizu as renowned, definitely Ozu and Mizoguchi both have very closed frames, right? Everything is contained within that shot in a way that is masterful and feels totally under control. And I think it's very easy to venerate that and say, oh, these are great filmmakers because of the mastery of control that they have. But with Shimizu, everything's a little bit out of control. And so that can feel like it's not mastery, right? It can feel chaotic. But I think that's again, to a contemporary sensibility, actually what's so beautiful about them. But part of it, I think, what's interesting to go back to, your point, Alonso, about the role playing and how far that can go until the adults come in, is that, the deep space also creates this world in which they're always in public. They are never in private. There is always someone coming through a door, right? There's always someone in the background watching them. There's always a neighbor who's nearby. And so it creates this, kind of landscape where it's bustling and it's full and it's beautiful sense of community. But there's also the sense that no one has a private identity because they're always in public and acting in public in some ways. And that's how Shimizu is interested in the individual, is what is the role that they play, which again, I think is very close to Wiseman. person in that way. Like the actual test of the individual is not what they're like on their own. The test of the individual is like, what are they like when they have to, put on a uniform and say a line that has been like rehearsed a million times.
I also like the public spaces itself in the hors-chambre always. So there's this anticipation of the hors-chambre public space through the idea of transmission, especially in Mr. Thank You, or I think in Tokyo Profile, he does that as well. Like he says something like, can you tell this or give this to this person? So we already anticipate what's going to happen on our way. Like sometimes it's really surprising, these encounters, but sometimes he creates by this imaginary hors-chambre that then become materialized within the frame. So I like that idea as well.
When I was trying to write about him, the first sentence of the article I would have written would have been that of all the aesthetic registers, the hardest one to write about is simplicity. And that's it. Shimizu is very simple, but he does something that's no one else does. And for this, I'm not comparing him to anyone else because I can't think of an equivalent, or at least anyone who makes it seem so effortless and simple, but which is his very particular framings. His characters are always at the center of the frame. The camera is further away than you would have it in any other film of that era. The shots are often symmetrical, and I'm very curious, if you think about Noel Birch and, To the Distant Observer and what he has to say about the, how Japanese architecture, helped spatialize Japanese cinema. I'm very curious as to what he would have said about Shimizu, because Shimizu does not use frames and windows in Japanese architecture in the same way that Mizoguchi does at all. There's breathing space. There's no hint of mastery in the sense of, imposing your will upon a material. Everything seems completely organic. And I can't think of anyone who can have that sort of framing with that sort of relaxed approach. And I can't quite think of anyone else about whom I can say that he's got a, relaxed but central framing and symmetry and yet completely unforced.
If I can just pick up on the point of messiness, which I guess in Shimizu is as you said, one of the only filmmakers where both messiness and symmetry somehow find an equal home. Instantly I make a connection with the final shot of the masseuse and a woman. Spoiler alert, but as the camera as the woman is leaving the spa and her cart is going up the hill, the camera moves forward in a very unusual way. And as if he's following her cart. It's a very beautiful camera movement, but it's especially beautiful because it's so messy in a way. It's so much you can feel the limitations of trying to do a kind of shot like that. It's struggling, it's clearly hitting the stones on the road, but nonetheless he's trying to capture this image. Particularly in that period of Shimizu, those gestures come back again and again and again, doing a shot that is not technically perfect, but somehow the spontaneity and the power of those shots is even more overwhelming.
That shot's really special too because, there are signature Shimizu shots, and one of the maybe the top signature Shimizu shots is a bunch of people walking along a mountainside, and they're walking towards the camera and the camera's tracking back. So, Mr. and Woman is a classic example of this. I think I asked everyone to watch Seon's Bell because it's basically nothing but that for most of the runtime, right? It's just people walking along a mountain path as the camera tracks back. And then you'll get it all throughout. There's this incredible sequence in Golden Demon where it's this 8-minute shot reverse shot, and the camera starts pulling them, and then they walk towards the camera, and then the camera will stop, and then they'll stop. And it's almost this back and forth between camera montage and characters. They're all moving in sync with each other. But that shot that you're describing, Chris, right? It breaks that. It goes the opposite way. It doesn't pull back. It pulls in. And maybe for the only time I can really think of in Shimizu. And there's something I really love with Shimizu too, which is that he loves irresolution. He really like a haiku in a way. These moments that just are not totally explained. So, for example, I watched Don Chorus last night, and there's a moment where a character just lies down on the grass, and then it just cuts to the clouds. and just him watching the clouds, which I think like if we saw that in like a 2008 era film, we'd be like, oh God, not again, you know? Like how much of this poetic cinema can we fucking take? But like in the context of something from like 1941, it really opens up the film in this really strange way. Like it's like War and Peace or something, you know, where like he's dying and looking at the clouds. And there's another moment where a woman's giving birth on the side of a road, and our bus conductor doesn't want to deal with it. So she leaves and she goes to a creek, and then she sits down at the creek and she puts hand in water to try to take a drink of water. And then she notices the fish, and she pauses, and it just cuts to all, I guess, like the baby fish. So there's some kind of connection going on to like the baby that's being born and then the fish in the stream. And it's just her watching the fish like this. These kinds of moments of irresolution are just really powerful. Like they're not explained. They don't totally fit within the context. They might have some, you know, thematic element. And I think that shot at the end of, you know, Sisters and Women, it's very powerful because it's like, well, how far can the camera go? You know, like how far can it just keep following? Like there's no right point to cut this shot off in some ways, and so you're more aware than ever that all you're getting are these little glimpses here and there of life on the move. And just all of Shimizu's films, I think, deal with transience in some ways. One way I tried to define is like the open films are the characters themselves are the ones who are transient and they're moving. And then the closed films, they're the ones who are stuck and everyone else is moving around them.
The Sound of the Mist and Ornamental Hairpin end in exactly the same way, which is that they both end in the middle of a tracking shot. You know, the tracking shot is happening, and spoiler alert. So characters are walking an itinerary that they've walked before in the film, and I won't spoil any more than that. And so they're doing it again now, and the camera follows them in exactly the same way it already has. And in the middle of that movement, it fades to black, and the character for ending appears on the screen. And there's a sense in which, you know, you watch this and suddenly it becomes possible to do that. It's suddenly possible to end a film in the middle of an unfinished camera movement, because there's nothing more to say than what the camera movement is already saying in a way.
There's something beautiful, I think, also, right, with a lot of Shimizu films that you don't know where they're going because they'll take detours. Or sometimes there'll be just an entire film of detours. In a way, I do think Mr. Thank You is usually the most beloved because it's so clear, right? The construction of it is so clear in a way that it's not in a lot of other Shimizu films, that we like know where basically this is going to start and end. But even there, you know, one of the most incredible scenes in Mr. Thank You is this part where the bus gets stuck by the side of the road, and then they meet with these Korean construction workers, and that's all documentary. Like that Shimizu. That was not in the script. That was something that they added because they literally met these Korean construction workers on the side of the road, and Shimizu asked, you know, can we film this? And so even there, right, you'll get these like incredible moments that just come out of the filmmaking process itself, which again seems very contemporary, very docufiction, very slow cinema, right, but very not classical. One of everyone's favorite Shimizu shots, right, in Mr. Ohara Shisuke, where a donkey enters the frame and the camera just follows the donkey instead of following the characters. And it abandons the characters for like 30 seconds to go like follow the donkey, and then I think eventually comes back around to them, but is like, you know what, there's all these interesting things happening on the side of the screen, right, that most films don't make room for. And, you know, the donkey, or I think, you know, the construction workers, like those are both kind of examples of the same thing in Shimizu, of loving the detour, right, and taking the detour and like the long way around.
the few silent Shimizus that I've seen really do feel like these kind of, I don't want to say an apprenticeship, it's a little too blunt, but when I watch a film like Japanese Girls at the Harbor or even A Hero of Tokyo, I really do feel, someone who's really trying to work through a lot of ideas of style, particularly in Japanese Girls at the Harbor. I mean, it does have these commonalities, like for the fact that the two Japanese girls are mixed race Catholic girls living in this port town. I mean, Alonso's short Letterboxd review, I think, gets at this. Like, it's a movie that's just stuffed with all kinds of wild visual experiments. Like there's this moment in the church where the camera really jumps forward through these edits and then jumps back, and that film is really, really stuffed with those things, and it's not easy for me to make sense of that in the same way that I can if it's films in the late 30s.
For a while before seeing Japanese Girls at the Harbor, I had this idea in my mind, perhaps what I associate with the Shimizu form of mannerisms are perhaps vestiges of his silent era filmmaking, more ambience with the prevalence of landscape shots and medium shots. And then I see Japanese Girls at the Harbor, and there's a lot of these modernist elements. I wouldn't say modernist per se, but as Chris was saying, the jump cuts, and also this what will become his signature way of just doing this tracking shots, lateral tracking shots where the characters are kind of encountered mid-scene, mid-frame, which to me also kind of counters that idea I was kind of trying to position of perhaps he's just the more silent of the classical era filmmakers that I've seen, perhaps. But no, he's this tension again with this experimentation, these modernist elements that are already in this early 30s period. So to me it's all refreshing in a way, and also nice to not being able to locate him at all, even in this early period.
I think too, Japanese Girls at the Harbor is my favorite Shimizu.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I made a very deliberate decision never to mention it anywhere in the long Shimizu piece that I wrote. It doesn't come up, and I deliberately left it out because it's a weird thing when a filmmaker becomes known for one thing and then you go back to their filmography and they were doing something radically different that was quite incredible. Seven Seas is another kind of interesting, example of a Shimizu silent film where it's this giant epic about rich people. And about, heirs and, family betrayal. It just does not fit any conception of what we think of as a Shimizu film. I don't particularly like it myself, but that's neither here nor there. There's lots of beautiful things going on in it. It is hard for me to imagine him as anything other than a sound filmmaker, despite the fact that almost all the films he made were in the silent era, just numerically. Woman Crying in Spring is kind of a hybrid film. It's on the cusp of sound, and it uses a lot of sound elements, but then a lot of soundtrack. But the way he uses sound in it's really, really kind of wild and beautiful in a way that was maybe only possible in that era, where a lot of the action is being relegated off screen to sounds of things going on beyond you. And I think Shimizu just is a very off-screen filmmaker. A lot of what's going on is beyond the screen and beyond the frame. And that's pretty impossible to do in a silent film. It's very, very difficult. And so I struggle with this a little bit more. I do love Hero of Tokyo. Hero of Tokyo is also a really interesting case because it follows, I think, one of Shimizu's kind of favorite, pet obsessions, which is a child whose parent is who's disgraced socially, and then how that parent's disgrace is then reflected on the child, right? And the child now has to face social disgrace that is not their fault, and suddenly they are thrust into social stigmas that of the adult world for the first time that they were unaware of because they thought they were living in this carefree existence. And so I tend to see these, I guess, as kind of apprentice works, but that might just be because I have a bad sense of them or because I have bad taste in being able to appreciate them.
I think there's some truth to seeing it as apprenticeship, but I mean, it's also very interesting in many ways to see it as within the wider context of 20s and early 30s Japanese cinema, which is that all of those guys like Ozu, Naruse, Mizuguchi, Shimizu, they were all watching so many Hollywood films, so many foreign films in general, but so many Hollywood films, and trying to take in as much of the techniques and the experiments and the structures as they could, and then do their own versions of it. And so I agree on the whole that the silent films I like them a bit less. They're less good, but there's very few of them which don't contain remain like something fascinating. If you think about the way that the story of the passage from silent to sound cinema is usually told, it's usually told in the sense of, with sound comes the heavy equipment and the need to go indoors, basically into the studios. And if you think about it, that's precisely when Shimizu finally anchors his style and decides to go outdoors. Like, this is when he goes outdoors. He goes shoot Mr. Thank You on the roads in the provinces. But I think it's very characteristic that, none of the other Japanese filmmakers, at least, were doing that at the same time that I can think of.
ありがとう。あの人たちに見つかりゃしなかったかしら。見つかっちゃ恥ずかしいわ。
We've spent a lot of time on this kind of middle period because I guess that's the most interesting part to speak about with these late films. Like I really did struggle to just like find a generous way of seeing them to like greater and lesser extents for sure. But the one that really like sticks in my craw is Children of the Beehive, which was made in 1948. And then Mr. Shosuke Oharu the next year. And to me, like, Shosuke Oharu is like totally a Shimizu film, like absolutely formally beautiful. Like I think I said after it was done, like it's like a dictionary of mise-en-scène, like it's just like stunning. Like it's not easy for me to like totally explain it as like, oh, it's a different era. He came out of the war. He was devastated. His country was destroyed. He found like more interesting things to be concerned about, so therefore he kind of abandoned what he had been doing before, because he abandoned it and then he came back to it and then he abandoned it again.
Well, Children of the Beehive is like one of those films that is like clearly a film that is like inventing neo-realism as we know it. A bunch of suffering children in an urban environment who are all trying to make it through in a post-war fallen world where everyone is suicidal and wants to kill each other, right? And I do think another just issue I have with late Shimizu is just he allows this horrible wallpaper of music just to overtake these soundtracks, where a lot of silence is actually what's so beautiful about his films earlier than that. It also, it comes out of him creating this orphanage for these kids in the post-war and then saying, I want to film you. And so the documentary impulse of like that has been there for Shimizu just comes kind of blasting out into the open, where it's like, it's literally, I mean, it is the way he's filming Izu or something, which is this eternal beautiful province of Japan, like he now does that in the middle of of Tokyo. And there is something just still, I think, similar to the Rossellini in that era, where it's like the heavy-handedness of all the messaging is just so overwhelming to a contemporary audience. It just feels alienating in some ways, but like the actual raw power of the images to go out and say, I'm going to film outside in this environment is still, it's kind of explosive. Like he starts to produce his own films independently, and you can tell like the film stock is different. Like, it looks raggedy. It looks like it's someone who like found some 16 millimeter and like went out, and did verite filmmaking. And so there's a lot of raggedness to that film. There's a lot I don't particularly love about it. I also think Tomorrow There's Fine Weather, which is from 48 and is from is clearly a Shimizu film. It's about a bunch of people on a bus all broken down, learning how to get together, and it's very funny, but it also carries this element of grief and anger that starts to infiltrate the films. And then I think, if you look at Children of the Beehive 2, What Happened Next, that is like the most kind of classical Shimizu film. They're making jokes about the first film and about why the actors aren't there. There's a bunch of jokes about bedwetting. There's a bunch of people like coming in at a random window to annoy each other. Like, it's very light. It's very little carefree. And I think he did kind of have to reestablish himself in some ways. I will say, like, when I initially saw the retrospective, I was just very disappointed by a lot of the 50s films. But now going back to them, I think that there's a lot there that's really special and really wonderful. That lifelong kind of direction towards trying to, figure out how far he could push the fiction film to documentary. Children of the Great Buddha is like really probably goes farther than any other film in that direction, where it opens as a documentary of the children who are the characters giving people a tour. And so, but everything that all the information they give is wrong. And so it's like, it's this documentary of the kids in this real life location, doing like almost like a real life tour, but then the information itself is fictional. And then that is called into question by the film itself in this way that is like, almost like Tex Avery meta fiction in some ways. There's a lot about it that's really boring because it is basically a documentary of them just talking about ancient deities. But there's also something really special about that to me, that he was willing to go there and be like, yeah, 20-minute sequence of them just talking about statues. Let's do it.
When I think about the filmmakers we've spoken about in this podcast so far, if there's one commonality between all of them, is that at some point their careers collapsed and they just spent years making Drek. And I think that's like something we're drawn to, but this is a very unique case. I think this is like very different to that. In their cases, like usually their life fell apart, or they lost the ability to raise money, or times changed and they sort of were irrelevant. And of course there is this like wartime divide, like with Shimizu, that like makes an obvious story in some way. But it still doesn't completely explain it to me, and it's something that I think about a lot. And especially, today I watched Notes on an Itinerant Performer. It's really one of my favorite Shimizus now. But you can just feel like Shimizu is really, I don't know, like dealing with very different kind of material than he would usually deal with, and he's therefore applying a different sort of formal approach, let's say. And yet, like in the very first moments, after 30 seconds, I'm like, okay, like I'm super into this. Like this is not like the normal Shimizu, but like this is really doing something for me. I haven't had that with the late films, really. Like I haven't found that moment where I'm kind of like, okay, yeah, I get it.
I think I saw two from late periods. No, one. It's Tokyo Profile, and Tokyo Profile is also have this. I was completely fascinated by the cruelty, like this charming cruelty that film harbors everywhere. And it's because
charming cruelty is a great term for Shimizu generally, to be honest. That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah, I was totally on board. So I didn't have that experience that you had with Children of the Beehive. So I would be really biased because what I watched, I really liked it.
Yeah, actually, I have like a different, as Chris is mentioning, he has like this struggles with this transition from like the 40s to 50s. I kind of have that like push and pull during particularly the 40s period, which then I go fully on board in 50s. I've only seen like a couple like late 40s and 50s films, but I think it kind of clicked for me when you were talking about the similarities between Notes of an Itinerant Performer and Ornamental Hairpin, which you kind of described to me, Ornamental Hairpin, as being this kind of film aligned spiritually and formally with the 30s films. But I did notice that in the 40s seems to be more like formally precise in a way from I guess like from what I experienced so far, and that perhaps to me is a little bit less interesting. And as you were saying, this alludes to this progression towards more like that documentary, like traditionally documentary elements within his films. So when it gets to Tokyo Profile, which is basically like a musical comedy film, which a lot of like Shimizu like themes and like this like Oiku was saying, the cruelty of the urban landscape as well. But it's also framing this kind of like tension with his style, which also kind of, at least in my experience, goes back to Japanese Girls at the Harbor, which is also like a anomaly film in a way, because it's kind of like Shimizu dealing with like a genre material with gangsters and with melodrama, like hiding emotion that, at least from the films I've seen, isn't that recurrent. So I think Tokyo Profile kind of showcases that kind of like anomaly element as well, which to me is interesting and fertile, but I can totally see if you're very into like the 40s films, perhaps that's not like the case as well.
All these kind of filmmakers, Ford probably is the best example of this, would have like a one for you, one for me deal with the studio system. Shimizu's is kind of extreme. Like you really sense which ones are the ones for him and which ones are the ones for the studio. And like, there's these shots, like I forget if I think it's in Dancing Girl, where like he goes out to the streets and suddenly you get these beautiful lateral tracking shots. And it's like Ken Jacobs' Orchard Street or something, where you're like just on this street getting to see all this life. The stories in the 50s are the actors would go to Shimizu and say, how do you want me to act this? Like what should my expression be? And Shimizu would say, act it. They say, well, like, where should I go? Like, where should I move in the scene? And he'd say, move. You know, like literally giving no direction of the actors in any way whatsoever. And they hated working with him. And I think like there definitely is a way to read that this is someone who is really depressed, frankly. I think hadn't gotten the acclaim he deserved, was now focused on this orphanage post-war, clearly had a lot of grief, and then tried to do his own independent productions, and those didn't really take off, and then was stuck back in the studio system. And there's a kind of desolation to the late Shimizu films that feels very at odds with the kind of carefree, fun-loving, lightness that we like to associate with him. There was probably a mood change from the country itself. Narase is not very good at being carefree, right? Like his 30s carefree movies feel like a little heavy, but like once he's able to get to like the heaviness of post-war, like Narase feels like set free by that, whereas Shimizu is kind of the opposite. He feels kind of bogged down in it. But I do think there's also a way that it tends to match late style and generally where the filmmakers become a lot more blank. There's a lot less expressiveness, but at the same time that expressiveness is pared down to these really key elements. And there's like a moment in Image of a Mother, his last film, where there's just a tap that's just dripping water and you're just hearing each drip of the water, and it's like one of the most incredible uses I think of like sound in a movie for like what it does to the scene. And you realize like he has attained formal control in the 50s, and that is both something that is very sad because he's kind of a filmmaker that we really never wanted to see attain formal control. But on the other hand, like when he exercises it with that formal control, some of the tracking shots he does in like Sentimental Idiot, like I think that dripping water and Image of a Mother, like it's really strong. And then I would say Children of the Beehive I have personal mixed feelings about, but like Children of the Beehive 2 and Children of Great Buddha, like those two films are just they're so him, and they were passion projects that he clearly gave everything to. And then even stuff like Shinomi School, which is like a little plotting and like really wants to talk up how great the teachers are and helping these students, and this kind of humanist lens that today I think feels a bit creaky. But it ends with a scene where like the kids are reading a letter to their dead classmate, but they can barely read. They're only like 5 years old. So they're trying to read this like really moving letter, but they can barely get the words out, and they can barely say it. And it's like that collision of like this very dark drama with this kind of documentary impulse. Like it still comes out in these different moments in Shimizu in the 50s that I find extremely beautiful.
We can talk a bit about Mr. Shosuke Ohara because, like, I really loved what you wrote, David, about that as a kind of like autobiographical portrait. When you watch that and you think about everything you just said about probably being in this period of depression, being in a country that's obliterated, and then just making a portrait of a kind of rich slob, basically, who's like living in his ancestral home and doing everything consciously or unconsciously to essentially destroy his heritage and destroy his standing in society is really moving to me. I mean, that really makes that a completely singular film. And there's just like so many moments in that movie that just like I just find immensely touching, particularly just at the end when he's sitting in his empty house and these two burglars come in to rob him, and he's just like, well, there's nothing here. Let's just sit down, let's just eat something. If we go back to like this kind of early impressions of Shimizu, as Alonso said, a lot of people frame it as like he's like a filmmaker of happiness and joy. He's like a filmmaker about children's joy, like nothing is too heavy in these movies. And then of course you realize when you watch the movies they're all like incredibly depressing. starting with A Hero in Tokyo, which is like one of the most bleak films I've ever seen. And then through all the films, like, yes, he's sublimating the darkness and he's like pushing it away, usually to the third act. But you just see again and again that these movies like touch like desolation and like emotional carnage in a way that's like, I can think of few other filmmakers who do that.
Yeah, I think it's, it's also really beautiful on like just mise-en-scène level that all this deep space at the beginning of the film is so bustling and there's so many objects and he's just surrounded by people everywhere. And then by, as the film goes on, the mise-en-scène is just vacated. And it's just gradually what you watch is the same scene and same space just, become a void. Until there's nothing left and there's no people and there's no movement and there's no objects and it's just him. And that again, that sense of duration that Shimizu has is like really singular to keep coming back to the same space and see how it's changed over time. But I do also think that part of what's interesting in that film is him losing everything is a sad thing, but it's also a very happy thing. It's also him liberating himself from all of these responsibilities because so he can just hang out and chill, which if you remember is actually the same ending as Notes of an Itinerant Performer as well. Like all she wants to do is be like, wait, I don't want all these responsibilities. Like, why did I take on all of this life for these other people? Like, I just want to smoke, right? And he goes through a similar journey, right, to say, let me give it all up and create a space of liberation in some ways where it's like I can just live my life. And I was joking about this before we recorded, but like, Shimizu I think is one of those classic people, and I know a few of these in my own life, who's like extreme workaholic who's very anti-work. He like continues to make all these films about the horrors of working and like how you should just be able to chill out and like hang with a donkey and smoke a cigarette while he's like working endlessly to do them.
Thank you, David and Nathan, for joining us to talk about Shimizu. Now we'll talk about some new films. So have you guys been watching anything else besides 1930s pastoral rural Japanese films?
Not during this period. Actually, watching the Shimizu has been quite heavy for me. I mean, I've watched, I think, 8 films, and that's basically all I've been watching. But a little before this, I was at the Berlinale, that great scandal-free festival that takes place in the German capital every February.
Boo!
Yeah, I mean, maybe I don't particularly want to go into individual films, although I can mention a couple. It's more just that the experience of being there was incredibly depressing. I mean, just as an overall package, and this, this I'm referring to even before this new scandal with Trisha Tuttle has happened. But it was just a very depressing Berlinale, one that made me doubt whether I would go again, because it was very, very cold and the movies were not very good, although I did see some good movies. Just the kind of lumbering nature of that festival, like simultaneously massive and sprawling while also like unable to address important points. I just felt very strongly. I also got an eye infection because of the fucking coughing people and the freezing cold air blasting in my face. But I did see some good movies, so I'll just very quickly mention them for the audience's benefit. I saw the new film by Pascal Baudet, Beaucoup parler, which is in English translated as A Lot Talk, which is a really, really good film about language. As someone who's constantly learning languages and struggling to express really basic thoughts, I felt very seen by this movie, which is about Algerian immigrant in France who basically over 17 years has refused to learn French for some kind of psychological reason, and now needs to because the apparatus of the state is crashing down on him. I love learning languages, but I'm not like him in that sense, but I do feel close to him in the sense that I can see how you can just, when you're trying to speak a language that you don't speak, you just get stuck in these ditches of lack of meaning where you're just talking around using the same few words and clearly the other person is really not understanding you. So in that sense, it's very beautiful. I saw the new Andrzej Novaes-Oliveira film, If I Were Alive, which is a really nice film. If you like Andrzej Novaes-Oliveira, it really delivers on that like sedentary pleasures of his other films, but it also is like a little more ambitious at the end. Also Ted Fent's new film, Auslandsreise, that foreign travel, is like really, really good. His last film, Outside Noise, was a bit of a deviation for me because it was about like young, beautiful hipsters. And I like his films most when they're full of these like geeks who can barely speak and yet are like obsessed with like high literature. So this film kind of finds a middle ground because the people are still beautiful, but they're also part of a very obscure reading circle. And also Angela Shanlek's new film is really a masterpiece. And I also saw the best film I think I've seen in 5 years, which was a film completely overshadowed by the scandal around it, which was that Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer, pulled out of the Berlinale. The reason she was there was to present this film, and that got completely buried in the news, but it's a restored version of an Indian TV film from 1989. That's like one of the best films I've seen about the English language. You know, maybe coming back a little bit to the Pascal Boudet film. But I also saw my fair share of horrors, this being the Berlinale. Chief among them, the Karim Ainos, which is like a film that he should be jailed for making. It's awful. Just so awful.
He has a bunch of those, actually.
Yeah, I think this was my first experience with him and also the last.
Yeah, I think I've described him as a middlebrow terrorist in a way.
On that point, this is like a horribly middlebrow person trying to do lowbrow trash, and that's what's so unforgivable. Yeah, awful.
That's even worse, I think. Oiku, what about you?
I've been to 2 press screenings this week, so I think I can talk about those because there's no embargo, I hope. One of them is a Palestinian film, All That's Left of You. I think it's an interesting case because personally, it's definitely not what I like about this historical epic scale in historical and political films. But I understand why these films matter in terms of representation and why we need or public needs these films. I think Anne-Marie Jassir's Palestine 36 is also a similar tone, the historical films, because from the period of Nakba to the present time, there isn't many fiction films that trace what happened in Palestine and the Israel systematic attacks and invasions. So to bridge those gaps and to give a certain representation, I think now filmmakers tend to turn back to the past and make these historical films, and this is one of them, I think. And I really believe that there's probably a personal history from the filmmakers connected to filmmakers' family, but the way it's told is quite mainstream. So it's a generational story told through the lens of a family in 3 generations, starting with Nakba to coming to our present, and there's this storyline where there's an organ donation to a Israeli child. So all these like family stories that connect to reach our present. I wished the story itself only focused one period on a daily life, because it's just like takes the story from the past and brings to the present, but never fully immerses itself in a period. So we only have the signifiers that are always connected to Palestine and Israeli invasion. For instance, the orange trees and Jaffa. So these really, let's say, signifiers or symbols that an audience member can easily relate or associate is like bombarding throughout the film. But I understand its necessity, and it's a good that we have these films, but I wasn't necessarily connected with this film, let's say. And the other one is a Berlin film, actually. It's the Golden Bear winner, the Turkish-German filmmaker İlker Çatak's Yellow Letters, which I also found quite cynical, trying to be critical while also being quite not critical about it, from a very safe zone, exhibiting the an argument and counter argument, and just like playing very safe. And it's such a hypocrisy that this film won. This film was given the Golden Bear in a Berlinale with such political tensions. Like, the film itself is defending so-called freedom of speech, where in a country that it's totally hostile towards. So I found quite skeptical about it. And I also started by watching this film, why are we keep making these films that are not necessarily making any point formally or ideologically, because I feel like if you have this as a subject, as a storyline, so people expect you to have a certain point, and your ambition as a filmmaker is to just bring this contradictory positions that are there's no solution, that there's no way to resolve them, then why are you making it? I think it's just like a very self-centered and depressive, and that brings nothing to the table. Why are we making these films? How about you, Alonso? Maybe you saw something like eye-opening.
Yeah, this was kind of a depressing series of choices from us, so
I wanted to watch Send Help, but Latin America happens a lot that at some point they don't give these films a chance, so they only show like the dub versions. So I was like, I shouldn't do that with Sam Raimi, one of my guys. Well, there was another film shown in theaters, another January discovery, a hidden gem, if you will, which is Christoph Gans' The Return to Silent Hill. But I won't talk about that film because I have the hope of one day doing like a Christoph Gans episode. It's perhaps my favorite film I've seen in theaters like in 2 years, perhaps.
Wow.
It's kind of like a PlayStation 2, like Jean Cocteau, in a way. but that made me like go back and do like a retrospective of Christoph Gans films. For those that don't know, he's like a French filmmaker from the 90s, mostly working on horror films, fantasy films. He's kind of a cult figure. He has a lot of like maximalist, like 2000s films. He has the original Silent Hill, which I know is kind of like a cult classic right now, and also like insane French blockbuster called Le Pack de Loup, which is kind of like 18th century werewolf film, and it's almost like 2.5 hours long, like kind of like a Gore Verbinski vibe to like Pirates of the Caribbean. But the film I wanted to talk about is his first directorial credit, which is like an anthology film he has, which is a film I've always wanted to see because it's like almost like algorithmically created for me, which is like an anthology film co-directed with Brian Jusna of Society fame, and also the producer of Stuart Gordon, and Shusuke Kaneko, who is the director of the nihilist 90s Gamera films. And that anthology, the whole concept is they're doing like their own versions of Lovecraft stories.
Wow.
So Kaneko does his version of like Rats on the Walls, but it's kind of like intersection of Rats on the Walls with Shadow over Innsmouth. Kaneko does the Cold, which is basically Cool Air. The one who does the intersection of the Rats on the Walls and Shadows over Innsmouth is actually Gans. And the final one, Brian Jusna's Whispers, is basically Whispers in the Dark. Purely like a 1990s, like kind of like straight to DVD anthology film around Lovecraftian like B-sides, but also by this collection of filmmakers who are each one of them is doing their own thing in their own industries, kind of like working in like disreputable like genre films, but also we got clear like love for the craft. To me, like Christoph Gans' story is so fascinating. Christoph Gans' first film, like his student film, is like an homage to Mario Bava, and then he's like the feature film he does afterwards is called Crying Freeman, which is like a Hong Kong inspired action film with Mark Dacascos, which is like a martial artist. He also features afterwards in Le Pack de Loup. So basically, like that film, Necronomicon, if you're into this kind of like weird filmmakers, and you like Society, and you like Silent Hill, and you're also into like Gamera films, and for some reason you thought like, oh, I want all these guys to coincide and do like Lovecraft adaptations, I think Necronomicon is like 90s trash at its highest. So that's my recommendation this week.
Nice. The new film is like really unloved, I have to say.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of been surprising to me. Because in my Letterboxd bubble, it's just like 4 stars plus, like all the sequels I follow. But then I see like the normal people reviews, and it's like 1 star. I do have like theory about that. There's like a lot of like video game fans that hate this film because it takes like some liberties with the source material, and also it does a very brave thing to me, which is it embraces the aesthetics of like not the remake of the film, but like the 2004 PlayStation 2 version. So it kind of like mirrors that like visual grammar, which is very jarring and very outrageous. But it's just like, yeah, it's perfect for me. It's a very earnest film, very noble film.
Okay, Christoph Gans episode coming up. Silent Hill, Return to Silent Hill, Beauty and the Beast.
Please.
So thank you very much for listening to this episode about Hiroshi Shimizu. Thanks to David Phelps and to Nathan for joining us. If you have any letters, comments, feedback, please send them to us at outskirtsfilmmagazine@gmail.com. Next week, we are going to be staying in Japan, and we will be focusing on the star of such films as Lady Snowblood, Female Prisoner Scorpion, Blind Woman's Curse, and Battles Without Honor and Humanity, as well as the singer of such songs as The Flower of Carnage, Uramibushi, Yatokari, and Shura no Hana. That is Meiko Kaji. So see you next week.